All right, joining me late this evening is Kristy Pirano. We are the hosts of Kabul'd Together. This is our latest episode. Kristy, thank you as always, for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
Before we started this, we were giggling about something that happened regarding certain personalities who one would have thought would have been anti-refugee to all of a sudden, be talking about how important it is to bring refugees here from Afghanistan, SIV applicants, and how Biden has done a bad job of it. And one of them even retweeted you. Let's talk about this, because I think this leads into a wider discussion about the divide on the right between SIVs versus no SIVs. Go ahead, Kristy.
Yeah. So I think one of the probably most prominent kind of flips in modern times has been Laura Loomer. So she is she was pretty vocally anti-Muslim and even run for Congress kind of on the platform of supporting Trump's Muslim ban and kind of the idea that all Muslim refugees are, their values are incompatible with Western values. They're all kind of secretly terrorists and this kind of thing. But now with the Biden administration having left behind like 90% of special immigrant visa applicants in the pipeline, and it's not clear, we still don't have a whole lot of hardcore data on exactly who did get evacuated. I think about 3% of them were like principal applicants for SIVs, and maybe up to 10% were like principal applicants plus family members of the like 60,000. And there were other Afghans, some of them were like human rights activists or people that maybe weren't in a visa pipeline, but like are really at risk. And then there were also a significant number of like Afghan army special forces units that worked with the CIA that were evacuated. So there was definitely corruption in the process. There were definitely people that got evacuated that shouldn't have been, people that just knew someone in the Afghan army or paid someone in the Afghan army to let them in the gate, or just managed to push their way to the front of the crowd and get thrown on an airplane. But basically of the 60,000 people that were evacuated, I think it's on the order of 7,000 to 10,000 that are like special immigrant visa applicants or in the special immigrant visa pipeline. So these being military interpreters, Republicans consider themselves to have been supportive of these people. But then for the last 4 years, there were a lot of people, and most Republicans in Congress were somewhat supportive of it, but not really wanting to stick their neck out that much for SIVs by and large, because they kind of didn't want to upset the apple cart too much with the Trump administration. So it was like supportive, but not really in your face of the administration. And then you have people like Laura Loomer that were like quite supportive of Trump's Muslim ban and very much like reinforcing the sort of right-wing narrative that we don't need Muslim refugees in America, which does include most special immigrant visa applicants. But then she has recently sort of latched on to this Republican narrative that, which I believe is a completely valid criticism, that the Biden administration did not do anything to help evacuate SIVs. And in fact, they made it very difficult during the whole evacuation for SIVs to ever get evacuated. And consequently have just betrayed tens of thousands of people that risked their lives to help our military. So I have been fairly actively tweeting about like left behind interpreters and stuff like this. And I doubt that Laura Loomer follows me on Twitter. I didn't check that, but I really doubt that she does. But anyway, at one point I had quote tweeted something about an interpreter having been killed, or at least someone who, I think it was an SIV applicant, even if he wasn't an interpreter per se. He was in the process of applying for a special immigrant visa based on his affiliation with the US military, and he was arrested by the Taliban and beheaded in front of his wife and kids. And I believe maybe the city of Herat. It was not Kabul, it was one of the other big cities. And then this had been publicized as like, this is what's happening to the people that we left behind. So I quote tweeted that and said the Taliban hasn't changed, and put the hashtag sanction Pakistan, because as we've discussed, Pakistan is really what enabled the Taliban to remain, I mean, they provided safe haven to the Taliban for 20 years, and then they provided personnel and equipment for them to go and take over Afghanistan. And then I didn't check back for a few hours, and then I had hundreds of likes and retweets and dozens of comments. And then I was like, oh, somebody big must have retweeted this, and turned out it was Laura Loomer that had retweeted me. So sort of a curious position I find myself in, of having been pretty much on completely opposite her on what I would have been saying about Muslim refugees for the last 4 years, and now we're both in agreement. And she's been tweeting about how terrible it is that the Biden administration left all these military interpreters behind, even though for the last 4 years she didn't have very much to say about the Trump administration making it increasingly difficult for military interpreters to immigrate. So, I mean, I do take the view that if someone's doing the right thing for the wrong reason, you should still accept their help. But it is an interesting quandary, and seeing these members of Congress and senators on the right on TV talking about how terrible it is to leave military interpreters behind. And a lot of these were people that I actually personally approached, sometimes even personally met, begging for help with this interpreter I've been advocating for that's been stuck in Pakistan for the last 5 years. And it's like, well, yeah, we can kind of like send an inquiry once in a while, and we can, nicely ask if they'd be willing to think about this, but really nothing, no real serious commitment behind that to really force the Trump administration to answer for their actions. So yeah, it's like hypocrisy is alive and well in some cases. But I try to be sort of pragmatic enough to say, okay, even if you weren't doing anything for the last 4 years and you want to start doing the right thing now, even if your motives are not great, I'm still happy to take any help that's offered that can help save these people.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the divide on the right, in terms of the response to refugees. We've been talking about this a lot, but it's always fascinating to see, like, you have people like Glenn Beck, who are actively flying refugees into this country. Then you have people like Tucker Carlson and the J.D. Vances of the Republican Party, who are saying, these people are, their culture is not compatible with ours, or whatever excuse they'll come up with. And, what I find amazing is that some people, like, as you pointed out with Laura Loomer, some people have flipped on this issue. And I'm disappointed it took Biden bungling Afghanistan to get Republicans on board with refugees. But hey, take what you can get. So which side do you think is winning right now? The Glenn Beck side or the Tucker Carlson side?
I think that, like, politically, I think that heavyweights in DC are, like, in terms of Republicans, are on the Glenn Beck side. It's like, I don't think there's very many actual current members of Congress that are trying to capitalize on anti-refugee sentiment, at least with respect to, like, special immigrant visa holders and stuff. I mean, not that every Republican in Congress wants to evacuate 100,000 more people from Afghanistan, but I think if you just look at Republicans, like, currently in Congress, the majority of them would be saying we really need to get SIVs out, and not saying, oh, hey, we shouldn't have, just let the Muslims kill each other. That's not our concern. But I think, like, sort of in the right-wing media, there is more and more of the narrative of, we shouldn't be evacuating these people. And then it does get dicey. Like, I mean, someone could be critical of the people that the Biden administration actually evacuated without, like, you could believe that, yes, we should have taken out all the military interpreters, but nothing more, or whatever. And so just because someone is going around saying, oh, well, who are these 60,000 people we did evacuate? And are they really at risk? And are they really vetted? I mean, just because someone raises those questions doesn't mean that they wouldn't support some other subset of Afghans being evacuated. But I think some of these people like J.D. Vance are not trying to be nuanced. So I'm not defending the people that are going around saying, oh, look at all these unvetted, Afghans, and a bunch of them are probably terrorists and stuff like this. I'm not defending that narrative at all. But there is, I guess, there's some room in the middle where you could legitimately be asking questions about, like, how, even if some of these people really truly were in need of evacuation, how do we vet them? How do you prove that in some cases, like, apparently like every Jewish person has been evacuated from Afghanistan at this point, and a lot of the Christians have been as well.
That reminds me.
So
you
if you
want me to tell that story?
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, there was like for a long time, for like probably like the past 10 years or so, there was one Jew left in Afghanistan. It was just one guy, and he was like he practically lived in his synagogue. Like there was just a synagogue in Kabul, and it was just him, and everyone else was left. It was just him, and he practically lived there, and he kept up the synagogue. But multiple offers for him to get out of there, and over the years he refused every single one of them. Now finally he has left.
Yeah, I guess I didn't realize that it was down to just one for several years. I did see Mindy Bells had tweeted and that the last Jewish person has been evacuated from Afghanistan, and I do not have data on like exactly how many Christians are in Afghanistan. There's probably a not insignificant number of Muslim background believers that are potentially like Christians, but not publicly Christians. I know there's a group of a few dozen Christians in the Kabul area that groups are working on evacuating. I'm not honestly sure if they all have gotten out at this point or not. I talked to some of their advocates, but that was a few days ago, so hopefully some of them have gotten out. But you do have this dilemma of like undocumented people, because just because someone doesn't have a passport or a visa process doesn't mean they're not targeted by the Taliban. But how do you distinguish between some religious minority or human rights activist or something that literally couldn't afford to pay for a passport or tazkira, but was really in need of evacuation and maybe got on some State Department list to be evacuated, versus someone who was just wealthy enough to pay someone to put them on an airplane and then claims to be an undocumented person at high risk, because that's better than saying, oh yeah, actually here's my passport and I'm just a rich businessman who doesn't want to live in Afghanistan anymore. So yeah, it is a difficult thing, and I don't totally blame people for asking the question of how do we vet these people. And we sort of saw the pendulum swing from the Trump administration was denying 90% of people from Afghanistan or Iraq, even if they had strong ties to the US, and claiming that they were all a discretionary security concern. But now we've evacuated like 60,000 people from Afghanistan, and they've said, oh, there were about 100 that were a potential security concern, and we sent 2 of them back to Kosovo. And so then like 2 out of 60,000 is an extremely small percentage. So I mean, in my view, the percentage of Afghans that there's some legitimate discretionary security concern is probably, less than, is probably more than 0.01% and a lot less than 90%, especially for ones that are US affiliated. So we've seen like a huge pendulum swing here, and something that now the right is capitalizing on. And yeah, I am concerned that, I think it's good that some elements of the right have now been forced to go back to supporting refugees to try to get back at Biden. But then you also have more and more of the narrative that, oh, look, all these unvetted refugees.
Right. I just saw a couple of cringy foreign policy related tweets in my feed. This is not exactly Afghanistan, but it's in the same neighborhood. First is that John Kerry apparently shrugged off a question regarding China's persecution of Uyghurs, saying life is full of tough choices, which is, not great. The second is at least one member of Congress says she's going to vote no on funding Israel's Iron Dome system, which is, in case anyone doesn't know, is Israel's defensive missile system against Hamas rocket fire.
Yeah, I'd seen I guess it was left out of one appropriations bill and was going to be brought up for a second vote, and then some on the far left decided to capitalize on saying on criticism of Israel and this sort of thing. So yeah, I had seen that, and I don't know exactly why it ended up getting left out of the spending bill. It is widely expected to pass, right? Just there's going to be
it'll be interesting to see who are the naysayers and who we can really say claim to be principled on foreign policy but are really not. And I honestly think there's a reason why Israel gets singled out. I think you and I both know why Israel gets singled out for things that other countries like China or North Korea or Belarus would not be singled out for.
Yeah, and I personally, I mean, I used to sort of come from the, I thought like very patriotic background of like sort of being offended when America or Israel was criticized, and I've softened that position now. Like I don't have a problem with valid criticism of the U.S. or Israel, but what I do have a problem with is hypocrisy. And so, I mean, yes, I think that there are, like, I have been criticizing United States Citizenship and Immigration Services for 5 years in their treatment of an Afghan family. So I'm not of the opinion that the U.S. can do no wrong and that every time someone's denied, there's a valid reason. I mean, I've been saying the opposite for 5 years, but when you have nothing to say about China and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and other countries like this, and the only country you want to criticize is Israel or the United States, it's like, okay, there can be valid human rights concerns, but at least Israel is not throwing gays off of buildings. It's like these other countries are. And if you look at the UN, it's like the UN human rights is run by like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, and they just sit there and pass resolutions about how bad Israel is.
It's anti-Semitism. It's that's pure and simple. It's what it is.
Yeah, and even like when it's with the George Floyd killing, which it was inappropriate to use lethal force in that circumstance, and it is a tragedy whenever any human life is unnecessarily stamped out. So I am not saying that the outrage over that was not justified, but when you had countries like Turkey saying, we're just so grieved by this tragic loss of George Floyd, and meanwhile Turkey has nothing to say about the Pakistani police like disappearing people by the tens of thousands every single year in Pakistan, you're probably not sincerely that upset about a few documented instances. It's just like a way to poke your finger at the US. It's not a genuine concern for human life. If you have nothing to say about China's genocide and Pakistan like disappearing thousands of Pashtuns every year, and your own country like disappearing and imprisoning thousands of Kurdish people every year, if those are not of concern, and then you want to talk about Israel and the US, even if it's a totally valid criticism of this, it's it's kind of a hypocrisy is alive and well situation. And I find it frustrating that the world insists on being silent. I mean, there's been some talk of human rights abuses in China, but it's like China and Pakistan, it's just like we expect them to just murder people by the tens of thousands, and so no one even really, it's not news because it's just like what they do, and it's just what we expect them to do. And then all the focus on Israel for what they're doing. And I do believe that there's the anti-Semitism aspect to that.
Yeah, you can tell the direction of Kabul'd together right now just by the fact that for the first time ever we're talking about something that's not related to Afghanistan because it's faded from the news, but we want to keep it in the news. But we're reliant on information from others being reported, and I just haven't seen much of that in quite a little bit. Anything else you want to say? It's getting late, so maybe we'll close it here.
Yeah, well, I guess I would, since we haven't really talked about Afghanistan. I mean, I would say that in some sense, it's not like what the Taliban's doing is not quite as bad as what I had feared, and that I had feared that like come September 1st, there was going to be an internet blackout and just people like murdered by the thousands. And there definitely is killing. There are targeted killings. There are people that are in extreme risk.
And they're going door to door, apparently.
Yeah, yes, there is some of that going on. There's some of that going door to door, searching for people that have some sort of US connections or US documents or whatever. And there's definitely like them trying to ask around and get intel on high value targets and chasing people down. And like I've heard people with like multiple stories of being tracked down by the Taliban and having to put on a burqa and jump out the window and things like this. So there's a lot of that going on. People are at extreme risk. Most people with some sort of US or NATO affiliation, which is potentially up to 1 million Afghans that are now like in hiding, like not able to go to work and not sure how much longer they can afford to, like they're going to be able to keep their family alive with no income. So it's a humanitarian catastrophe. And I think it's shameful that the world is doing so little about it, and shameful that the world doesn't even want to talk about it. I would say that it hasn't, the one thing I'm grateful for is that the Taliban is still concerned enough about their public image that they're not as bad as I had feared, and that they're not just like lining up thousands of people and gunning them down. And that could be coming in a few months, but at least we sort of have some, at least short period of time where the Taliban is trying to convince the world that they're not as bad as they are, as they really are. And so I would say that the assassinations are definitely happening, but like a lot of even some US military interpreters that have been able to sort of like blend in for a while, but their time is going to run out like sooner. Like if they're in the biometric database or whatever, they can't just live the rest of their life pretending that they were never affiliated with the US. Like there is going to be intel on them. They're going to be in a database somewhere, and eventually Taliban is going to catch up with them. So I'm not, and I think it is shameful that the world has done so little to let Afghans get out of the country. It's like borders are closed, embassies are closed, about the only way, and not very many flights, and the Taliban saying that if you don't have a passport and a physical visa, you can't get on the flights. And there's rumors that there are people just paying $10,000 to get on planes, and having travel agencies say that they have a passport, but like most Afghans can't afford that. So yeah, and there's a whole number of groups working behind the scenes to try to help this situation, including groups I volunteer with. But the government is really AWOL on this, and it's like they send SIVs all these emails about how like, oh well, just figure out how to get to another country and transfer your case. And then when they actually go to Pakistan, some of them and say, oh, I want to transfer my case to Pakistan, they say, oh no, that's not one of the options. It's like that's about the only country that any Afghan who's not extremely wealthy can even possibly get to. And then they get there and the embassy's like, no, we don't process SIVs in Pakistan yet. And it's like, it's just, the State Department just feels totally divorced from reality. And there are rumors that, things are going to pick up. There's going to be more flights. It seems like the State Department has started trying to work with neighboring countries to like accept Afghans without a visa who have worked for the US. So, I mean, we would welcome any such developments, but it's just a total dereliction of duty on the part of really the entire world for Afghans being targeted by the Taliban now.
We talk about dereliction of duty around the entire world. I want to tell you something about just my own country's role in this. The day that the whole crisis in Afghanistan started, this was August 15th, that same day, Justin Trudeau called an election here. And you might have heard this because that election just concluded. And it's funny because the polls, actually, before the election was called, the polls had the Liberals gaining a solid majority in Parliament. And then the same day that they called the election, this whole crisis in Afghanistan occurred, and there were real questions about the government's role. Like we only got like a few thousand people actually to safety. In terms of like interpreters, we only got like a few thousand out there. We left like several thousand behind. And Trudeau's fortunes in the polls just declined dramatically, to the fact that he was only actually, and was looking for a while that the Conservatives would win, but in the end, he only got a minority government again. So this might have played an issue, maybe not as big as other issues, like the fact that Canadians just didn't want this election to be called. But I'd say that Afghanistan, and the fact that maybe Trudeau left Afghanistan unattended to while he was campaigning for his for the majority that he didn't get, maybe that played a role in it.
Yeah, it would seem like it. And I mean, Biden's popularity has tanked like 15 or 20 points in the last couple of months, and probably some of that has to do with surging coronavirus after claiming victory on defeating coronavirus. But I think the Afghanistan issue definitely led to some of that. And I think like short term, we're seeing less attention to Afghanistan, but there's going to be a lot of material. As we talked about, Republicans are happy to use any opportunity to get back at Democrats, even if it involves a little bit of hypocrisy. So I mean, the Republicans have so much material. If they retake the House, they can just have nonstop hearings on American citizens that were left behind and and things like that. And they're going to be able to put veterans on ads saying my interpreter was beheaded by the Taliban because the Biden administration failed to evacuate him. And so I think the Biden administration is just assuming that Americans have a short attention span and they can declare victory and get everyone to move on. But even the fact that the State Department is now the White House said like a week ago that they're going to support private efforts to get more people out of Afghanistan. I think the fact that they've relented on that and they seem to be trying to support more SIVs getting out of Afghanistan, I think they did finally get enough pressure from Congress and veterans groups that they're trying to do something now. But just because, I mean, people are going to short-term move on, but I think there's like a lot of material here that's going to keep coming back to bite them, as it should, because any administration that treats our allies this way should be held accountable. Yeah, and so and just because the Trump administration was like, they set the stage for all of this, but still the Biden administration is the ones that pulled the trigger, and they could have just told the Taliban that we're not withdrawing until you start following your end of the deal. But they weren't willing to do that. They thought they could score some points by just getting out of Afghanistan and saying, oh, hey, we're at peace, we're not at war anymore in this great world. And I think things deteriorated faster than they anticipated. But that still does not excuse their failure to reverse course when it became clear what was going on.
Yeah, I'm thinking about cutting it here just because it's 10:35 at night when we're recording this, at least on my end. But Kristy, as always, love having you on. We're going to keep on this. So just, yeah, sorry, just got distracted by something. Kristy, thank you so much for being on here, and I'll have you back, okay?
Yeah, thanks for having me.